We've got a lot of different movement patterns in the screen: a squat, a hurdle step, a lunge, a push-up, a crawling pattern we call rotary stability. We got a leg raise, we got shoulder mobility. If you look deep, and I mentioned this in the movement book, there's a lot of intentional redundancy. You're flexing the hips quite a bit, you're extending the hips quite a bit, and you're not just doing it once, you're doing it over multiple patterns. Because when we see inconsistency between your lunge and your squat and your hurdle step and those other movements, inconsistency means you've got a bad pattern, but those parts work very well in other patterns. You thinking software now? You got to have a lot of ankle mobility to get a 3 on the lunge. You got to have quite a bit of ankle mobility to get a 3 on the squat. What if you get a 3 on one and a 2 on the other? Well, the mobility is being used at a much better way at the pattern you do at a 3 level than a 2 level. So when we see a consistent limitation all the way through movement, we're thinking mobility, okay? And I don't think we can key on the ankle enough. As a matter of fact, we built the FMS to be very ankle-centric. We load your ankles and see if they bend in a squat, in a step, in a staggered stance or a lunge, but we even need to be clearer than that. Why? Because the evidence is saying squeeze those ankles, they can drive a lot of bad behavior. So we've got this little ankle screen, and I want you guys to look at it and learn and read something about it, because long before we do single leg stance or motor control, if you're doing it on an ankle that doesn't have enough motion to at least send the bare minimum sensory information up, you're going to have a problem. Now, stop right there for a second and think about how many articles are taking up space on the interweb, the World Wide Web, on glute activation. Let's activate the glute. Well, let's go back to a principle. Are we going to try to change behavior without changing perception? If I'm going to change behavior without changing perception, I'm just going to make you do lots of bridges and deadlifts and squats and hope that you will grow glutes and behave better with hip extension. But if that ankle is restricted, then it doesn't send a signal that we need hip extension. Think how that works together. When I'm dorsiflexed at my ankle, I'm extended at my hip, and if I can't get into dorsiflexion, I don't need hip extension. What do? I use my quad and my calf to advance my leg forward. So, we're trying to change glute behavior very often without amplifying ankle perception, which drives glute behavior. So, we got a really good science saying long after your swollen and painful ankle sprain doesn't hurt anymore, nobody ever checks to see, can you cover the minimum? What's the minimum? Like 35 or 40 degrees. We got a really cool way to check that. Check it right now with your iPhone. But my point is, be consistent and be valid. So we've painstakingly looked at which ankle mobilities actually test well among multiple testers in multiple environments. We got a screen. If you clear the screen, I'm not saying your ankle's perfect, I'm saying your ankle's not your biggest problem in that pattern. But if a screen catches your ankle, I can't prove it's not until you get me some ankle mobility. And ankle mobility is really, really easy to do. If you've got hips and knees that aren't restricted and you can measure that and the ankle is, there's a good chance the ankle's restricted. Well, because the joint alignment is out or because we got too much tension in the muscle. Simple. But when you've got a restricted ankle and you also know your hip mobility, like in a Faber test or internal, external, is also limited, that's a pattern. Bad internal and external rotation right here, bad dorsiflexion, plantar flexion down there. You got to break the pattern. So if you're not working on the hip and the ankle simultaneously, you won't be sending a better, healthier signal. Now, when we sprain that ankle and it swells up, it gets limited with muscle tone and the extra fluid in the joint. But what happens when that swelling goes down? Is the ankle clear? A lot of people aren't, but the ankle doesn't hurt, so they don't focus on it. So they go on a run, they play the sport, they do the thing. And before you know it, 6 months in, they don't even know they got an ankle problem, and yet they do. However, measurably, and science is telling us this, 6 months after that ankle is no longer on your radar, that glute on that same side of that ankle still isn't back to where it needs to be. Why? Well, if you lost dorsiflexion in the ankle, you don't need that extra 10 degrees of hip extension, and that's sort of what the glute does, and it's what keeps the glute awake. So, we can just smack on your glute and try to wake it up every day with a bridge or a squat or a deadlift, or we can make sure your ankle's above the cut and put you in a robust environment that requires dorsiflexion and hip extension at the same time, and your brain will never forget it because they're really complementary movement patterns and they work together in a pattern.
For more information, visit functionalmovement.com.